thank you, Laurie. That actually means a lot to me. Laurie and I have been friends since graduate school. We've been arguing over philosophical topics for more years than I'll care to remember. So thank you, Laurie. Thank you, Jonathan, Leanne. Thank you, all of you, for coming here today. In philosopher's style, I don't have a PowerPoint. We do handouts usually. So apologies if you were excited for the next PowerPoint presentation, but you have now a party favor that you can take. So Marilyn Monroe once said, "I believe that everything happens for a reason. People change so that you can learn to let go. Things go wrong so that you can appreciate them when they're right. You believe lies so you eventually learn to trust no one but yourself. And sometimes good things fall apart so better things can fall together." This sentiment that everything happens for a reason is one that we've all heard countless times. Many of us take comfort in that thought during hard times. And yet I think we also know that it's complete superstition. And what I want to examine today is the extent to which this commonly held superstition that everything happens for a reason, that nature is infused with purposes and reasons, influences our thinking about metaphysics, our thinking about the structure of the world around us. And I want to think about the extent to which some of our intuitions about objects and the structure of reality deserve to be debunked for inheriting this superstitious perspective on reality that we naturally incline towards. So there's two things that are working in the background for me, by way of an overview of what I will be saying. One is some findings coming out of psychology, in particular the work of Debunking, discovering that people seem to be prone to what she calls promiscuous teleology, thinking of everything in the world, not just artifacts and biological organisms, but rocks and clouds and everything, as having reason and purpose. The other thing that I want to bring into the story is the way that debates in contemporary metaphysics tend to go these days, that being my home area. Metaphysics, really for the last 100 years or so, since G.E. Moore announced against the neo-Hegelian idealists who thought that there was something like that there was just one big experience and that's all there was. He announced, here's one hand and here's another, and he said that he was more confident in the truth of that than he could be in the premises of any philosophical argument to the contrary. And since then, a lot of metaphysicians have been driven to try to articulate and sustain what gets called a commonsensical view of reality. So on the one hand, we have this emerging idea that at least some of our intuitions about the world are beholden to superstition. And on the other hand, we have this ongoing practice among metaphysicians like myself of trying to defend the intuitive view and taking intuitions to have probative force without really thinking through their psychological origins. So what I'll be suggesting is that many of our intuitions about objects should be seen as inheriting a naive teleological Aristotelian perspective on reality. We are in that sense something like natural-born Aristotelians. And that to that extent, many of our intuitions about objects deserve to be debunked, to be considered lacking in any evidential force. So I've told you what I will say, and now I'm going to go about saying it. So I do, though, want to add one caveat before going in, which is that this talk for me is an opportunity to take some ideas to you guys and learn from you, many of whom will know far more about psychology than I will. So I'm hoping that I'll have the opportunity in Q&A to learn from you about studies that I should be looking at, different experiments that I should be running. So, section 1, promiscuous teleology. So here I'll be largely relating some of the work that Kellerman and others have been doing. So, as I was saying, it's now emerging that our tendency to thinking of all things in terms of purposes is not just selectively focused on artifacts and organisms, but is promiscuous, extends to everything. So it's long been understood that we think about artifacts and biological organisms functionally through purpose. So I have a few quotes on section 1.1 on your handout. I'll read a quote from Frank Kyle. He says, historically, there have been many arguments for a design stance, which can include teleological interpretations and tool construction and use. Notions of functional architecture are among the most cognitively compelling ways of approaching the biological world and most of the artificial world. So it's long been understood that at least in these particular domains, we have a tendency towards teleological. What's emerging now is that that tendency is not domain-specific, but seems to be very general and merely masked among educated Western adults through certain kinds of educational processes. So Kelman, apparently she sort of, she'd have children in her lab, she'd ask them why the rock is pointy, and instead of giving the kind of efficient causal explanation that we might try and give in terms of how the material got formed, the children would spontaneously say things like, oh, it's so animals construct themselves. And so that's not what we would expect. But what emerged is that this childhood tendency to teleological thought is never outgrown, but only masked by education. So what came out through subsequent work, Tanya Lombroso, Deborah Kelman, and Deborah Seitchik investigate how people with Alzheimer's disease experience a recurrence of teleological thinking. And later work by Kelman and many of her co-workers has shown that all adults, including physical scientists, when sped up and not able to engage in reflective thought about the domain, just naturally gravitate towards those same sorts of teleological explanations that sounded so silly out of the child's mind. It's natural, you don't have to think of things in terms of this kind of common image of there being these sort of instinctive, animalistic type 1 cognitive modules versus reflective type 2 cognitive modules. But if you like that way of thinking, it's natural to think that we have some kind of type 1 based tendency towards teleological thinking for everything, everything, everything. And then we have some sort of reflective type 2 sort of cognitive module ability to override that when we try, focus, and pay attention. I should mention that there's now a really interesting ongoing debate about the source of these naive teleological intuitions. Some people, so I have a quote from Paul Bloom on the handout, who says that one of the most interesting discoveries in the developmental psychology of religion is that the bias towards creationism appears to be cognitively natural. 4-year-olds insist that everything has a purpose, including things like lions, to go to the zoo, and clouds, for raining. When asked to explain why a bunch of rocks are pointy, adults prefer a physical explanation, while children choose functional answers, such as so that animals could scratch on them when they go. That famous anecdote. So one perspective that Bloom and others take is that we are natural creationists. Kelman herself argues for a different reason. She thinks that we are natural Mother Nature Gaia theorists. So the Gaia hypothesis is that Earth, or Mother Nature, maybe the cosmos as a whole, is this living organism that strives to protect us and protect life. And she's done research that suggests that it's actually that's our, as it were, at least for many of us, a kind of cognitive default or a view that many of us tend towards that seems to be correlated with given teleological explanation. So I'm not going to enter into that debate here. I do want to just point out that though much contemporary metaphysics, as I was saying at the beginning, is driven by this idea of upholding common sense, no one seems to think that if it turns out that common sense is naively creationistic or naively Gaia theoretical, that would constitute a good metaphysics. I think that many of my colleagues in metaphysics should be theists or Gaia theorists to the extent that this does turn out to be the kind of thing that looks to be intuitive. what I want to just draw attention to, for those of you familiar with the history of philosophy, is how much this kind of perspective looks like an Aristotelian perspective on reality. So for Aristotle, material objects are what he calls hylomorphic compounds. There is matter and there is form. But not among the forms that a given object has, one of them is special. It has the role of being the substantial form. And the substantial form plays the role of organizing the matter and imbuing it with purpose. So this, and Aristotle has this notion of the final cause, that for the sake of which. And he has this idea that all things in nature can be explained by what they are aiming for, which is what their substantial form pushes them in the direction. So I've got some quotes from Aristotle in your handout that I won't read, but a nice quote from the Aristotle scholar David Charles that I'll read to you. So Charles here is explaining Aristotle. Charles is new. He's explaining Aristotle. He says, "It is the presence of a final cause, purpose, telos, which makes the relevant planks and bricks into a house. Being a house, on this view, cannot be reduced to being a mereological sum of bricks and planks. There is more to its unity than that of the sum of its components and their physical interrelations. For merely to specify these is to ignore the goal, whose attainment is required if there is to be a house. Houses are the result of the operation of the final cause as a principle which organizes the relevant type of matter." So Aristotle has this image of nature as driven by final causes. This is an incredibly powerful and historically important image of nature. It's one, however, that has, since the scientific revolution, been regarded as obsolete. I'll read a beautiful passage from Francis Bacon. He says, famously, "For the inquisition of final causes is barren, and like a virgin consecrated to God, produces nothing." So that gives you a sense of the kind of more modern attitude towards final causation. John Hawthorne and Daniel Nolan, in a contemporary article, give a nice summary of the contemporary reception of the idea of substantial forms and final causes in teleological nature. They say, teleological thinking is part of a superseded, pre-scientific muddle about how the world works. I'm going to assume that is the correct perspective to take on teleological thinking. If you want to defend teleological thinking, well, okay, I'm going to assume for the purposes of this talk that it is indeed a naive, superseded, pre-scientific muddle about how the world operates. Though Aristotle, I think, was wrong, turns out to have been wrong about the structure of nature, I think he was deeply insightful about the structure of the folk conception. So even though nature, I think, turns out not to have the kind of teleological structure that Aristotle imagined it to have, I think our folk image of nature is, I think that Aristotle had an excellent grasp of how we tend to conceive. So in that sense, I think we are, at least in this respect, natural-born Aristotelians, even if that does incline us towards a superstitious and superseded view about how the world works. Section 2. So now I'm going to talk about metaphysics. So for those of you not familiar with the metaphysics literature, there are all these ongoing debates about the structure of things. One of the most prominent debates, spurred in large part by Peter von Inwagen's work, is the question of when a plurality of things composes a unified whole. So here, hold one thing in my right hand and one thing in my left hand. Do these two things form a unified whole? A handout. Or under what conditions in general does a plurality of things compose a unified whole? There is a big debate in the literature, and it's not universally, but widely thought, that it is incumbent upon a good answer to the question of when parts form a whole, that it respects common sense. Eli Hirsch So there's one prominent view out there called universalism, is that every plurality whatsoever, no matter how scattered and disparate and causally disconnected, every plurality whatsoever forms a whole. Your nose, the Eiffel Tower, and Alpha Centauri, they form a whole, every plurality whatsoever. So the universalist view is often criticized for falling afoul of common sense. Hirsch says, I understand perfectly well what it means to talk in plain English about such things as cars, bees, human beings, books, and the Eiffel Tower, or even to talk about such marginal things as noses and car heads. Noses are so marginal. Never mind. But it's crazy to say, in plain English, that there exists something composed of my nose and the Eiffel Tower. And Ned Marcuse says, as a sort of motivation for further discussion of the question of when mereological composition occurs, he says, no one has yet defended a view consistent with standard pre-philosophical intuitions about the universe's composite elements. So you can see that Marcuse is assuming, in the way that many metaphysicians tend to assume, that it would be a good making feature of an account, a vital feature of an account, that it accords with our intuitions. Indeed, one of the difficulties in metaphysical inquiry is the paucity of evidence that we have to bring to bear on our questions. So if we don't have intuitions to guide us towards answers to questions like when does a plurality of objects compose a whole, there's not much else left for us to go on. So the debate is driven by intuitions, as probably will not surprise you either. Different parties in the debate report robustly different intuitions that just so happen to fit their theories. Whether it's that they started off with different intuitions and that drove them to different places theoretically, or the theory is informing intuitions, or probably there's some more complicated feedback between those. I have no basis for speculating on how that works. But one thing that those of you who are familiar with the metaphysics literature will be familiar with is this frustrating scale where each side says, my view is the one that accords with intuition. And the debate doesn't proceed further. And there's no empirical discipline or control on these sorts of things. Moreover, metaphysicians have gone on and speculated from about why the folk have the intuitions that the philosopher thinks that they have. So David Lewis, in the last quote in section 2.1, talks about contrast with surroundings, adjacency, acting together, acting jointly, and it says we are more reluctant to affirm the existence of mereological sums of things that are disparate and scattered and go their separate ways. So that's just I guess he's just guessing, maybe based on his own case and people to talk to, as to on what basis we make judgments of composition. So I, together with a student of mine, David Rose, who's done a lot of the work on this project alongside of me, started wondering whether we could give some empirical discipline and control to the debate about what people's intuitions are about when mereological composition occurs. What is the folk theory of mereology? When do people tend to say that a plurality of objects compose a whole, such that we might hold a metaphysical theory against that and judge it by its conformity or lack thereof to the folk theory? And what we found was that none of the factors that Lewis or the other metaphysicians thought were driving intuitions had any made for any difference that we were able to. Maybe there's differences out there that we failed. That's always possible. We were not able to find any of the factors that I just mentioned from Lewis's work. But there was one factor that had a powerful and persistent effect, which was, I hope this won't surprise you now, given what I've been saying, purpose. What we found time and again was, in a myriad of studies, when we invested the plurality of parts with a kind of a joint, single purpose together, then people tended to say that there was a unified. just as Aristotle thought, that it's the substantial form that imparts unity to the object by giving it a purpose. I'll illustrate this. I just replicated, just sort of giving you a little bit of a graph of just one of our studies. I'll just talk you through briefly one of our studies. I'll talk to a second study as well. So we started off with a famous case from von Inwagen's work. So von Inwagen thinks, he says, well, he claims most people would say that mereological composition occurs when the plurality of objects are in contact. So he says contact, that would be the most popular answer. And he says, but here's a counterexample, says von Inwagen, to the thesis that mereological composition occurs when there's contact. Imagine two people who stride across the hall towards each other and shake hands. At the moment when they shake hands, they come into contact. But, says von Inwagen, no one would say that at the moment at which they touch and come into contact, a new object is thereby created, which has the shape of sort of two people side by side connected through their hands, has the mass of each person added together. No one would say that that would make it. So what David Rose and I did is, well, first we tested that case. And von Inwagen's right. People really don't think that that makes it. But what we then did is we invested the handshake with a purpose. We added to the vignette that there was a sculptor who had arranged the handshake to serve as a model for a statue, because these were political opponents who were coming together, and there's going to be a statue of unity to commemorate this historic truce between their rival political factions. And when the handshake served the purpose of being the model for the sculpture, intuitions flipped. You can see it we did a Likert scale 1 to 7. One strongly disagreed that there was a unified composite object. 7 being strongly agreed that there was a unified composite object. In the baseline case where we don't invest the handshake with purpose, the mean 2.5, very low. In the case where we add purpose to the handshake, the mean goes up to 4.9, significant difference. Both are significantly different from the midpoint. So we seem to be getting a strong flipping of intuitions from investing the handshake with purpose. We did a bunch of other studies. We looked at cases with organisms and artifacts, but we also looked at cases with rocks. Because we wanted to make the case that this teleological conception does extend promiscuously towards our thinking of all of nature. So we had cases where there was an avalanche and rocks came streaming down the mountain. And we varied lots of factors, like whether the rocks at the bottom were in contact with each other, whether we gave a name for the landslide and stuff like that. And the one thing that got people tending to say that there was a unified object is saying that the rocks together form a beautiful arrangement that could serve as a rock book. We have purpose on the brain. Another standing metaphysical concerns how objects endure through time. What kind of changes can a thing survive? It's well known to work with Lance Ritz and many other people that we tend to distinguish between the superficial and the deep characteristics of objects. If you paint someone's face, people will tend to say that the person will survive that. That's a superficial change. But if you if you mess with their insides, people are less likely to say that the victim of that experiment will survive. So we know that people are drawing distinctions when among which sorts of properties, changes in which are survivable. And what David, Rose, and I speculated was that it might be that we are thinking of things as having purposes, and that we think that something survives when it preserves its premise. Or at the very least, that our intuitions about endurance are significantly driven by the question of whether the purpose of the thing has been sustained. So David himself ran a beautiful series of studies involving, he read a lot of them. The one I'll report the one that I like best. It has some rocks. And we're told in the vignette, it said that the rocks provide a habitat for when the rocks release a chemical which allows some worms to live in the rock. The worms eat the chemical. The chemical allows the worms to survive. A background thought going on here is there's independent evidence that the kind of purpose that people tend to attribute to rocks and other natural phenomena are eco purposes. So being a habitat for worms would be the kind of thing that would be a very natural purpose for people to attribute to the world. So David imagines two sorts of different changes that the rock might undergo. So we have a geologist, Frank, who's got his hands on the rock, and in one case, and the rock is slowing down the production of chemicals. The worms are starting to die. In one case, Frank dents the rock slightly. In another case, Frank takes a sledgehammer and pulverizes the rock into dust. And so we've got dented versus pulverized, and then David varies whether that helps the rock to release the chemicals, that helps the chemicals to be released and allows the worms to survive. So we have dented, the worms don't survive, dented, the worms survive, pulverized, the worms don't survive, pulverized, the worms survive too. And lo and behold, what David finds is that people say that the rock survives so long as the chemical is released and the worms can survive. You might have thought, I would have thought before doing this work, naive, that people would say that the rock can survive being dented, little chip, regardless of what happens to the worms, and that the rock cannot survive being pulverized into dust with a sledgehammer, regardless of what happens to the worms. That's not what people tended to say. People tended to say that the rock can survive being pulverized to dust so long as the continuation of the purpose of providing a habitat to the worms is observed. I should mention as well that there's some recent work by Julian de Freitas, Kevin Truvia, George Newman, and Joshua No, and they looked at normative impacts on persistence judgments. So, for instance, they had one of their many studies. They imagined an academic institution, the Iserlohn Academy or something like that, that was in Nazi Germany, and they had one case in which the Iserlohn Institute changed by caring more and more about academic values and less about Nazi propaganda. And the other case went they described as going the opposite direction. The institute just became a kind of propaganda machine, focused more and more on disseminating propaganda and less on academic values. And what they found was that people tended to say that the institute survived the good changes, the changes towards academic integrity, those good things, and didn't survive the changes in the direction of propaganda. And they replicated this sort of finding along for a wide range of entity types and a wide range of conditions. So they sort of a starting point example was, imagine you're revising a scientific paper. Under what revisions does the paper survive? And the idea is that the revisions that make the paper better, those are the ones that the paper survives. But the revisions that make the paper worse, well, that's a different paper. or at least we have more of a tendency to say it's a different when the revisions are made. And one thing that I want to speculate, and I had a helpful email exchange with Josh Miller about this, I think he and I have the same idea, is that all these findings about persistence, both the initial findings about the distinctions we make between the superficial and the deep characteristics of things, the findings that David observed with purpose, and the findings that Freitas et al. Observed with normative considerations, are all at bottom teleologically driven. The deep characteristics of things are their essences. Their essences in the Aristotelian scheme are given by their substantial form, are given by their purpose. The reason why normative considerations play a role is because we have this conception of, in the case of persons, the true self, but in the case of institutes, the true academy, the sacred halls of academia, and we see these objects as striving towards becoming their true perfect selves in a kind of Aristotelian perception of the thing towards what it wants to be. And so, speculation, it may be that our naive Aristotelian perspective on reality is informing this whole cluster of stories. Final sort of cases. It shouldn't, you might be familiar with, I guess this in some places, clarity, that the way we think about other possibilities runs in many ways parallel to the way we think about other things. So with that background, it perhaps shouldn't be so much of a surprise that these findings about endurance through time can be replicated as findings about endurance or identity across possibilities. So I ran some studies in some ways similar to David Rose's studies about the geologist of the rock, where I imagine I told participants kind of a Turk about a mountain range, the Tenua mountain range, that, among other things, is home to a unique kind of antelope. And I said, then the video went on that due to global warming, the Tenua mountain range is in danger of either minor or major earthquakes, depending on which version the subjects got. Then these earthquakes will, if they got major, will flatten the mountain range entirely. If they got minor, these earthquakes will lower the elevation of the mountain range slightly. And then it was added that, and then conditions were added as to whether the antelopes will survive the earthquake, will be able to live after the earthquake, or whether they'll go extinct. So, just like you might have thought in the persistence through time cases that a rock can survive being dented but not being pulverized by a sledgehammer, so you might have thought that a mountain range can survive an earthquake that lowers its peak slightly, but can't survive an earthquake that flattens it completely. But what the subjects of my experiments tended to so the prompt was, if there were such an earthquake, would the Tenua Mountain survive? So that's kind of counterfactual, that's conditional. Would, in that possible case, the mountain survive? And people, this is not at all a surprise, given what I've said so far, it was whether the antelopes lived. That's what drove it. Not whether the mountain was. The mountain could be flattened for all they care. The Tenua Mountain survived as long as the antelopes still have up. So, I think that this kind of finding broadly coheres with what's already well known about object categorization. So, it's well known that we tend to associate what something is, what sort of it is. Whether it's a chair, or a lampshade, or an umbrella, with what it's for. So I think with that in mind, it's not so surprising that we also associate whether something is with whether there is something that it is for. And whether two things are the same thing, with whether they are for the same thing. At the heart of it is our use of sorts to classify objects. Together with this idea that a sort is associated with the purpose of the thing. Our notion of an object was formed in the primordial conceptual ooze, encrusted with teleological mark. And so what I've argued so far, bringing together Kelvin's ideas about promiscuous teleology and metaphysical intuitions together with some adventurous and experimental metaphysics. What I've argued so far is that people's intuitions about objects, when they compose, when they survive, and how they extend across possibilities, are driven by these superstitious teleological considerations. And now I'm in section 3, debunking. So here, at least among certain sorts of philosophers, is one fairly orthodox way to think about the epistemology of metaphysical inquiry. We have these folk intuitions, and they provide a kind of a starting point for inquiry. They give at least a kind of, at first glance, prima facie justification for a certain belief. And that prima facie justification can convert to all things considered, ultima facie justification, in the absence of ultimately undefeated defeaters. That is, that if something's intuitive, that gives you some evidence for believing it. And unless you find some countervailing consideration to defeat that reason, then in the end, you've got reason to believe that. And this is the kind of, those people who reflect on the methodology of metaphysics and reflect on this post-Morean methodology of be guided by common sense and your intuitions, they tend to say these sorts of things. David Lewis, in a similar concept, similar context, when asked why he should believe, why he should take, at least as a starting point, the things that seem intuitive to him, quips, where else should I start? With the things I don't believe? So with this kind of epistemological backstory, there's an idea of debunking, where the way that debunking works is it provides defeat. So the idea is that intuition provides always provides some kind of prima facie justification. But if that intuition can be in some way debunked, then it can be shown to fail to provide ultimate justification. The initial appearance of justification that it seems to provide is shown to be misleading. Of course, from Guy Cajon on your handout, connecting debunking to undermining defeaters. But here's kind of, I think, maybe a helpful guide to how to think about this. Imagine that someone tells you that there's going to be a storm tonight. Normally if people tell you about the weather, believe them. That has some sort of initial credibility, and we tend to naturally trust people. But if you then find out that the only reason why the person told you that is the person has been reading tarot cards suggested to them that there'd be a storm, you then realize that the person's testimony provides you no reason one way or another to believe or to hold any view about whether or not there'll be a storm. Even if the person happens to be right, even if there will be a storm, the fact that they told you on the basis of a tarot card means that their testimony lacks evidential proof. It's testimony based on a kind of lunatic view of the matter. So the relevant folk intuitions in the metaphysical cases concerning when composition occurs, when objects survive change, and how they extend through possibilities, given that they are driven by a superseded pre-scientific muddle about how the world works, or no. They're likewise based on a lunatic view, a superseded view of the time. And likewise, they are lacking in evidential force. They should be discarded. And here I'm in sympathy with Bertrand Russell, who, lovely quote from Russell, says, "I regret to say that all too many professors of philosophy consider it their duty to be sycophants of common sense, and thus, doubtless unintentionally, to bow down in homage before the savage superstitions of parents." So I want to, in the remaining time here, point out a couple of things about the style of debunking story that I've been telling about naive metaphysical intuitions. One thing to notice is that it's a selective sort of debunking. It only targets those intuitions of ours that are infused with teleological thinking. One of the concerns in the literature about the methodology of philosophy that people have about critiques of intuition is this thought that it's ultimately going to be self-undermining. That in the end, we have to rely ultimately on some principles or others, some premises or others, for any argument whatsoever, and in the end, these are going to have to come from intuition. So if you doubt intuition generally, all you're left with is a blanket skepticism, which doesn't allow you to get any ultimate premises or inference rules into your arguments at all. Saul Kripke, actually in the course of defending a dualistic conception of nature, on which minds are not reducible to physical, says that some people criticize my argument for relying on intuitions, but in the end, I don't see what else anyone can, I don't see what else can ever be, or you can ever rely on. So what I want to point out here is that this is not a global skepticism about intuitions. It's a targeted debunking for those specific sorts of intuitions towards which our naive Aristotelian stance orients us. The final thing I want to point out is you might have thought that I'm the kind of, though I told you that I mainly look at metaphysics, that I'm a kind of hostile insider within metaphysics. That though I do metaphysics, I'm mainly out to critique metaphysics, and I think that there's something wrong with the use of intuitions in metaphysics, and that the whole game of metaphysics should be abandoned or something like that. That's the farthest thing from all. Again, I only want to I want to clean up our intuitions for metaphysical use, and not uncritically rely on arbitrary intuitions that have not been empirically vetted. That's what I want. And what I want to suggest at the end is that this project of debunking intuitions, which I think all of us should be interested in, this project of debunking intuitions itself has metaphysical presuppositions. So I think that metaphysics is ultimately not rightly seen as a target of debunking arguments, but as a partner in the process of debunking naive views. Consider Aristotle's view that nature is infused with final causes. There's nothing, or consider the naive view about color, that objects just have colors painted on their surfaces, real colors out there in the world painted upon them. Or consider the view that time flows like a river, or that there are basic moral properties guiding people out in the world. The kinds of views about reality that many of us might at least consider wanting to debunk. Why is it that we want to debunk these views. And we don't want to debunk certain other claims, like presumably few of us would want to debunk Moore's announcement that here's one hand and here's another. Moore got that one right. Few of us would want to debunk our naive mathematical belief that 2 plus 3 equals 5. And these are all of these beliefs and judgments or intuitions, and intuitions are outputs of fallible cognitive processes. Why is it that we seek to debunk some and not others? And I think the answer is that part of what drives us to debunk certain intuitions is that they don't fit with our metaphysical image of what reality is like. It's because in the scientific revolution, we came to a view of the structure of reality as only operating by efficient causes and not operating by teleological causes, that we take naive teleology, we take teleology to be naive, to be part of a superseded pre-scientific model, and to be worth debunking. It's because, in the case of color, it's because our best physics doesn't appeal to anything like real intrinsic colors of surfaces, but just appeals to things like surface reflectance distribution and wavelengths of light and that sort of thing. That we take it that whatever the right metaphysical story to tell is about color, it's a story that doesn't have color featuring as a real intrinsic property of things. It's because we've come to certain views about the nature of time that we might doubt that time flows like a river. So what I think is really happening when we seek to debunk certain intuitions is that at any given stage of inquiry, we have a view about what reality is. That view is ought to be informed by our sciences. It's also informed by our folk metaphysical intuitions, constant process of getting compared with scientific results and getting revised accordance. But we sustain throughout inquiry a picture of reality. The picture of reality changes. What's sustained is that we have a picture. We seek to debunk when we find our cognitive engine producing outputs that don't fit the picture of reality. So it's the task of the metaphysician to, drawing on our intuitions and scientific inquiry and anything else she can get her hands on, to produce the best picture of reality that she can. And that's a crucial input into the debunking process. So what I want to suggest, and this is the final diagram of the handout, is that cognitive science and metaphysics work together as partners. Cognitive science tells us about the cognitive engine that's producing the intuitions, and also about what the intuitions are, because that's often itself a contested. And the metaphysician then has the job of saying whether that cognitive output matches the world, in which case, thumbs up for that cognitive output, or whether that cognitive output doesn't match the world, in which case, debunking is. Thank you very much.